They weren't just actors. They were wolves in tailored suits, razor-edge men who stepped off the screen and into legend, not because they played tough guys, but because they were tough guys. Old Hollywood loved its stars polished and polite, but some of them refused to be tamed. They drank too much, fought too often, vanished into wars and wild oceans. They broke contracts, bones, and the rules that ran the industry. You couldn't write characters like this because they were already living them. This isn't about red carpets or movie magic. It's about grit, defiance, and the kind of fearlessness that no script could ever fake. Before the age of green screens and PR teams, these men stared down studios, censors, even war itself. They made America's enemies made directors sweat, and made audiences believe. They didn't ask for respect. They demanded it with a look, a line, or a left hook. Some were soldiers, some were outlaws. All of them were unforgettable. This is the story of 10 men who didn't just define the golden age of Hollywood. They stained it with smoke, sweat, and something dangerously real. The Savage 10. Let's begin. Sterling Hayden.
He said war was too important to be left to the generals.
They called him a movie star. He called it all a lie. Sterling Hayden never wanted to be famous. In fact, he hated Hollywood, hated the phoniness, the pretense, the cameras. But what he didn't hate, what he craved, was danger, truth, and the open sea. Before the fame, he was a sailor, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that could launch studio-bidding wars. He could have coasted on looks alone, but Hayden was built for chaos. When World War II broke out, he didn't stay in California sipping gin and posing for photo shoots. He joined the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and went behind enemy lines, running guns and leading resistance fighters in Yugoslavia. He earned medals for valor. He never once talked about them. When he came back, the studios tried to turn him into the next big thing, and for a while it worked. The Asphalt Jungle, Dr. Strangelove, Johnny Guitar, roles that cemented his image as a grim, towering force. But Hayden was never fully there. His mind was always elsewhere, on ships, on wind, on freedom. Then came the Hollywood blacklist. He was dragged in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He named names, and he never forgave himself. Called it cowardice, spat on the system, spat on himself. He walked away, took his kids, bought a boat, and vanished. Just sailed away. No press release, no farewell tour. That's how he lived. That's how he had to live. And yet he kept coming back, out of debt, out of obligation, but never for fame. You could see it in his eyes on screen, a kind of contempt. He wasn't pretending to be tough. He was tough. A man who'd survived real war, real guilt, and real exile. Hollywood couldn't touch that. He once wrote, "To be truly free, one must be willing to risk everything. I have and I am." Sterling Hayden didn't just act in noir films. He was a noir film, stormy, shadowed, unflinching. The kind of man the movies could never fully contain. Robert Mitchum.
Then how come there's a trail of blood leading right up to that table?
If cool could kill, Robert Mitchum would have been locked up for life. He walked through Hollywood like he didn't know it a damn thing. Half-lidded eyes, voice like gravel soaked in bourbon, and a permanent shrug that said, "Go ahead, test me." He wasn't acting tough. He wasn't acting at all. Born into chaos, Mitchum was bouncing around as a teenage vagabond, hopping trains, sleeping in jail cells, getting into fistfights before most kids got their driver's license. He didn't go to acting school. He escaped to acting after years of scraping by as a ditch digger, boxer, and ghostwriter for astrologers. Then came out of the past, and the legend was born. Mitchum became the face of film noir, charming, dangerous, unpredictable. He didn't play the hero. He played men with dark pasts and darker instincts, and he played them like he was one of them. In 1948, the cops busted him for marijuana. Headlines screamed scandal. Studios panicked. Mitchum, he lit another cigarette and said, "It was just a case of bad luck. I was in the wrong house at the right time." It should have ended his career. It made him a legend. He was too wild for the press to package, too honest for the system to own. He once told an interviewer, "I've got two kinds of acting, on a horse and off a horse." And when they asked if he ever rehearsed, hell no. Off camera, he was just as unfiltered. He wrote poetry, loved jazz, and could drink anyone under the table. But don't mistake charm for softness. Mitchum was a storm under control. You never quite knew when he might explode, or if he even cared. And that was the power of Robert Mitchum. He made indifference magnetic. He gave apathy edge. He looked the industry straight in the eye and dared it to blink first. He never played the game. He was the guy they warned you about in the game. And he never stopped moving forward, never stopped being the realest man in any room, camera or not. Robert Mitchum didn't act fearless. He made fear irrelevant. Lee Marvin.
Kind of a general, sir.
Just a plain, ordinary, everyday, home-loving American general.
Lee Marvin wasn't tough because of the roles he played. He got those roles because he was already the toughest man in the room. There was nothing polished about him. No studio sheen, no leading man vanity. He spoke like he'd gargled with shrapnel, moved like he'd just walked off a battlefield, and he had. Marvin was a Marine in World War II, serving in the Pacific, where he was shot in the back by a Japanese machine gun. He almost died. He came back with a Purple Heart and something colder behind the eyes. That chill never left him. Hollywood tried to box him in as a background thug, a brawler with a sneer. But there was too much gravity in the man. Too much history. Eventually, the industry gave up trying to soften him. They just let him explode. The Big Heat, The Killers, The Dirty Dozen. Lee Marvin didn't just play violence. He radiated it. You didn't watch him as much as brace for him. He had that rare, unsettling quality, the ability to be completely still and still feel like a loaded gun. He didn't fake fights. He didn't fake anything. Marvin got into bar brawls even in his 50s. Once punched out a guy for mocking his war record. Another time, he cracked a fellow actor's ribs during a scene because the script called for realism. And yet, beneath all that steel, there was a kind of sorrow. A man you sense had seen too much and felt too little for too long. That edge wasn't just anger, it was detachment. His characters weren't evil. They were simply done pretending. In 1965, he won an Oscar for Cat Ballou, playing a drunk, one-armed gunfighter. He showed up to the ceremony hammered, grinning like he couldn't care less. That was Lee Marvin. No PR machine. No apologies. Just raw, scarred truth. He was the kind of actor directors feared and respected. The kind of man you didn't direct, just unleashed. Lee Marvin didn't just bring war to the screen. He brought the cost of it. And that made him more than tough. It made him real. James Cagney. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall on a good day. But when James Cagney walked into a frame, he took up the whole damn screen. There was nothing gentle about his energy. He didn't saunter. He snapped, talked like a machine gun, moved like he was about to sock you in the jaw, and usually did. Cagney didn't play gangsters. He redefined them. When The Public Enemy hit theaters in 1931, America had never seen anything like it. A fresh-faced kid, blasting his way through speakeasies and back alleys, smearing a grapefruit in a woman's face without flinching. Audiences were stunned. Studios were panicked. The censors were furious. And Cagney? He just smiled and loaded up the next round. He came from the streets, literally. Grew up poor in New York, hustling for work, watching real gangsters run the blocks. He knew that world. He didn't have to research it. He survived it. Off-screen, he was a contradiction. A teetotaler. A quiet man who loved art, dance, and his farm. But he also had a fire you couldn't smother. He fought studio bosses like a one-man union. Took Warner Brothers to court more than once. Refused to play the Hollywood puppet. He was doing independent film before the phrase existed. And that toughness translated into every frame. In White Heat, he plays Cody Jarrett, a snarling psychotic mama's boy who ends his life screaming from a flaming tower. Made it, ma. Top of the world. It's not just a death scene. It's a statement. Cagney didn't go quietly. He never went quietly. What made him dangerous wasn't just his punch, it was his presence. You believed he could kill you or charm you, often in the same breath. He brought poetry to rage, rhythm to violence, and soul to every explosion. He wasn't big. He wasn't beautiful. But he was unforgettable. James Cagney wasn't a product of a studio system. He broke the system and walked away with the whole screen in his pocket. Kirk Douglas.
Apologize, sir, for not telling you sooner that you're a degenerate, sadistic old man. And you can go to hell before I apologize to you now or ever again.
Some actors play heroes. Kirk Douglas fought to be one, on and off the screen. That cleft chin wasn't just for show. It was a warning. A jagged mark on a man who never backed down, never shut up, and never asked permission. He came into Hollywood like a brawler in a tux, spitting out lines like bullets, eyes blazing with that signature rage. Douglas wasn't content to be a star. He needed to command the frame. Whether he was swinging a sword in Spartacus, bleeding pride and lust for life, or cracking under pressure in Paths of Glory, there was always something volcanic behind his performances, controlled, but just barely. Born Isser Danilovich to illiterate Russian immigrants, he clawed his way out of poverty, one brutal job at a time, dishwasher, janitor, wrestler, before landing in Hollywood. He didn't arrive with charm. He arrived with force. And he didn't just act like a fighter, he was one. On set, he challenged directors, producers, anyone who tried to water him down. He launched his own production company when studios tried to censor Paths of Glory. And in 1960, he did the unthinkable. He credited blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo on Spartacus, helping shatter the Hollywood blacklist with one stroke of his pen. No one told him to do it. No one backed him up. He just did it. because that's who Kirk Douglas was. He once said, "You haven't learned how to live until you've learned how to give." But giving, for Douglas, meant giving hell to anyone who stood in his way. Even as his body aged, that fire never dimmed. He survived a stroke, learned to speak again, and kept showing up at events, in interviews, on stage, grinning through the scars like he knew something the rest of us didn't. He didn't just portray larger-than-life men. He was one, a rebel in armor, a warrior with words, and a legacy carved not in bronze but in backbone. Kirk Douglas didn't follow the script. He rewrote it, one furious, fearless scene at a time. Humphrey Bogart. Some stars shine. Humphrey Bogart smoldered. He didn't look like a leading man. Crooked teeth, scarred lip, eyes that carried too much shadow. But when Bogart spoke, when he lit a cigarette and tilted his head just so, Hollywood stopped. So did the audience. You didn't know if he was about to kiss you or kill you. Before the fame, Bogart was just another stage actor bouncing around in forgettable roles. But the moment he stepped into the trench coat of Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, everything changed. He wasn't trying to act cool. He was cool because he didn't care if you liked him. He just told the truth and let the smoke settle where it may. Casablanca, The Big Sleep, In a Lonely Place. Bogart made cynicism magnetic. He played men who'd been kicked around too long to believe in happy endings, but still showed up for the fight. His characters weren't brave because they were fearless. They were brave because they were tired and still refused to quit. Off-screen, he was just as complicated. He drank too much, fought with producers, mocked the pretentious, and shielded the vulnerable. He stood up for friends during the Red Scare. And when the House Un-American Activities Committee came for Hollywood, Bogart led a protest to D.C., demanding sanity over paranoia. He was called difficult. He called himself honest. And somehow, beneath all that steel and smoke, there was soul. That's what made him dangerous. Not the gun, not the glare, but the suggestion that, under all the armor, he still felt, even if he'd rather die than admit. He met his match in Lauren Bacall, and their love story felt like something pulled from the movies he hated. Sharp dialogue, real fire, no false notes. Together, they were dynamite. Alone, he was legend. Humphrey Bogart didn't beg for stardom. He let it chase him and made it earn the ride. He once said, "The problem with the world is that everyone is a few drinks behind." Maybe, but Bogart was always ahead of the curve, cooler, smarter, and far more dangerous than anyone realized. Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster didn't walk into Hollywood. He vaulted in. Like the acrobat he once was, before the suits and scripts, he was flying through the air in a circus tent, muscles coiled, face focused, always mid-leap. That sense of motion, that urgency never left him. You felt it in every performance. Lancaster didn't just act. He launched himself into roles like a man on fire. The smile was part of the trick. Wide, magnetic, but beneath it was something coiled and dangerous. That's what made him special. He wasn't just a pretty face. He was a powder keg. And when he chose to go off, you couldn't look away. In From Here to Eternity, he made out with Deborah Kerr in the surf and turned a romantic scene into a full-body war cry. In Sweet Smell of Success, he became ice-cold and calculating, trading warmth for venom with terrifying control. And in Elmer Gantry, he played a false preacher with such manic energy, you couldn't decide whether to listen or run. Lancaster didn't play it safe. Not in film, not in life. He launched his own production company when studios told him to stay in his lane. He backed daring projects, anti-racist stories, anti-war epics, controversial roles that other stars ran from. He had the build of a boxer but the brain of a revolutionary. And he cared, fiercely, about politics, about integrity, about giving something real to the audience, even if it meant taking hits behind the scenes. He once said, "I've always wanted to play people who are bigger than life." What he didn't say is, he already was. He aged like a force of nature. No fade out, just more intensity, more control. Even in his later roles, Atlantic City local hero, you could feel that same power humming under the surface, like a tide that never fully receded. Burt Lancaster didn't need explosions or monologues. He was the storm, an athlete, a rebel, a master of his craft. He didn't follow the Hollywood system. He outran it, mid-air, always moving forward. William Holden. William Holden wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the one who made you lean in, because you knew he had stories he'd never tell. There was a sadness in his eyes, even at his brightest. A man caught between stardom and something darker. He didn't explode on screen, he burned. Slowly, steadily. And once you were watching, you couldn't look away. His rise was classic Hollywood, golden boy charm, all-American looks, a hit role in Golden Boy. But something shifted after the war. He served. He saw things. And when he came back, that shine had changed. What replaced it wasn't weakness, it was depth. In Stalag 17, he won an Oscar playing a selfish cynic who finds reluctant heroism in a POW camp. It wasn't a clean performance. It was jagged, layered, human. And that became Holden's specialty. Men try to hold it together while everything inside them was falling apart. Sunset Boulevard, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Network. His characters weren't action stars. They were haunted souls, men who had seen too much, said too little, and could no longer pretend. It was acting, yes, but it also felt like confession. Off-screen, Holden lived fast. Fast cars, fast women, faster booze. He struggled with alcoholism most of his life. There were affairs, fist fights, wreckage behind the charm. But even in the chaos, he stayed sharp. He cared deeply about conservation, risked his image to speak about endangered wildlife, and financed films that had no promise of return, only meaning. He didn't give interviews often, didn't chase headlines. And when his end came, alone from a fall in a hotel room, it felt like something out of a role he might have played. Quiet, tragic, real. William Holden was never just a leading man. He was the man you called when the story needed truth, raw and unsentimental. A flicker of regret in a world that demands confidence. A voice for the wounded. A mirror for the rest of us. He didn't act with force. He acted with weight. And no one carried it quite like him. Ernest Borgnine. If Hollywood was a room full of polished diamonds, Ernest Borgnine walked in like a fistful of gravel and made you love it. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't smooth. But he was real. You looked at him and saw a man who knew how to take a hit, fix a truck, or hold his own in any bar from Brooklyn to Okinawa. He wasn't acting tough. He was just being himself, a working-class bruiser with a wide grin and a heart no one saw coming. Before the lights, he was a Navy man. 10 years of service. Hard years. Real years. He didn't dream of stardom. He stumbled into it. And when he got there, he didn't try to fit in. He stood out. His breakout in From Here to Eternity was violent, menacing, unforgettable. But it was Marty that showed the world who Borgnine really was. A lonely butcher, desperate for connection, unsure of his worth. It was a small film with no flash, but Borgnine gave it soul. He won the Oscar, and he never let it change him. That was his magic. He could be brutal in one role, gentle in the next. Villain, hero, clown, it didn't matter. What he gave you was truth. Solid, unvarnished, deeply human. He was the guy who'd kill you in a war movie and fix your car after the credits rolled. In The Wild Bunch, he played a weary outlaw with fire still in his gut. In Escape from New York, he was a cabbie with 9 lives and a laugh that could cut through smoke. Off-screen, he was just as unfiltered. Loved to laugh. Loved to swear. Never apologized for who he was. He said once, "I wouldn't trade my life for anybody's. I've had too much fun." And you believed him. Ernest Borgnine didn't sell style. He sold substance. A blue-collar soul in a golden town. You didn't watch him and wish you were him. You watched him and knew him. He wasn't a Hollywood illusion. He was a reminder that sometimes the toughest man in the room is the one still smiling. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He wasn't made of flash or fire. He was made of granite. Solid. Unmovable. The kind of man who could say more with a sigh than most actors could with a monologue. In a town full of performers begging to be noticed, Tracy commanded attention by doing less and meaning more. He was a craftsman, not a showman, and that made him dangerous. Because when Spencer Tracy stepped into a scene, he took it. Not by force, but by sheer weight. He looked like he'd been places. Like he'd done things. You didn't question his authority. You just listened. In Judgment at Nuremberg, he played a judge faced with impossible decisions and made them with quiet devastation. In Inherit the Wind, he debated Darwin with a trembling voice and unwavering spine. And in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, his final film, he gave a performance that felt like a farewell, heavy, honest, and heartbreakingly real. He won 2 Oscars, was nominated 9 times, and never once gave a false moment. That was Tracy's power, truth. Unvarnished, unflinching, and often uncomfortable. Off-screen, he was just as complex. A devout Catholic who struggled with guilt. An alcoholic who fought for control. A married man in a decades-long love affair with Katharine Hepburn, publicly unspoken, privately unshakable. He lived in contradiction, but he acted with conviction. He didn't play heroes. He played men, flawed, burdened, striving. His greatness wasn't in the characters he portrayed, but in the depth he brought to them. He showed you the cost of dignity, the weight of choices, the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground. He once said, "Know your lines and don't bump into the furniture." It sounded simple, but in his hands it was a revolution. Spencer Tracy didn't roar. He resonated. A voice of reason in an industry of noise. A rock in the river. Not the most savage, but maybe the strongest. Because sometimes the toughest man in the room, they didn't rely on special effects or massive budgets. What made these men unforgettable wasn't the spectacle, it was presence. Grit, the kind of raw authenticity that couldn't be taught or faked. These were actors who brought their scars to the screen, who carried real-life experience into every role. War, hardship, broken homes, broken bodies, these were not polished, manufactured stars. They were shaped by hard living, and it showed. Old Hollywood often gets romanticized, the glitz, the glamour, the fantasy. But these men stood apart from the illusion. They were dangerous because they didn't play by the rules, because they weren't interested in being adored. They didn't ask for sympathy, and they didn't try to charm their way into the audience's heart. They earned respect the hard way, by showing up, doing the work, and delivering performances that still resonate decades later. Each of them brought something different to the screen. Rage, sorrow, conviction, silence. Some burned with fury, others with quiet determination. What united them was a deep-rooted authenticity. They didn't just portray strength, they embodied it, even when it cost them personally. In their lives, as in their films, they made difficult choices and carried the consequences. Today, in a world flooded with curated images and scripted authenticity, their legacy stands out more than ever. They remind us that real strength is not about being loud or perfect or invincible. It's about depth, honesty, the willingness to stand firm when it would be easier to fall in line. These were not just actors from another era. They were a different breed. And whether they went out in a blaze of fire or faded into the margins, they left behind a challenge to anyone who steps in front of a camera: bring the truth or don't bother showing up.